Welcome to the show, Cheryl.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
It's great to have you back in Oregon.
It's wonderful to be here, too. It's funny, I've been here for a week now, solid. And it seems like, wow, I get to be home for a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
Pretty exciting to be home.
It's very exciting.
So I wanted to talk about when you initially took over as Sugar.
Mm-hmm.
This was something that author Steve Almond was Sugar prior to you. And he had read something that you'd written, and he'd met you briefly, and he offered this to you. And you've said that you somewhat hesitantly took it. What were you worried about?
Well, first of all, it didn't pay anything. It had no following. I wouldn't get to say that I'd written it because it was anonymous. And who am I to give anyone advice?
Right.
So that was just all of that.
Right. So
Yeah.
it's of course you took this
Right,
job.
exactly. It was my kind of gig.
Right.
It was a really bad idea. But many of the best things have come in my life, at least, from bad ideas.
Well, and I read in an interview that you essentially just felt good when you thought about doing it.
That's right. I sort of didn't realize I was taking the advice I would go on to give thousands of others, and that is to trust your gut. And that's where I felt that. I really had that feeling inside of me when I thought of this idea of writing this advice column. There was really a kind of opening inside of me. And once I thought about it, of course, as a writer, books, stories, poems, essays, they have been my greatest consolation. And so I thought, well, that's what I have to offer, actually. That's what any writer has to offer the world is, I've spent all of these years really pondering the human condition, really trying to think about not just the self that we reveal to the world, but the actual self that we, I think, conceal often. And so when people are writing me letters, that's the self from which they're writing, really. They're saying, look, this is my deepest secret or my deepest sorrow. Here are the ways that how I feel contradicts the way I live. And so I was really, as an advice columnist, just being presented with the situations that I've grappled with on the page for years and years.
Well, what do you think that for people is the benefit of asking someone this question when you don't know them, you don't know their whole story, you just know this tiny little snippet? What do you think the benefit of that is?
Well, I think that it's almost like the reason we go to therapy, right? Because you get to talk to somebody who's a presumably neutral figure, and you can say anything to that person, and they're hopefully not going to judge you or condemn you or do any of the things that people do kind of out in the world. But what's been so interesting to me as Sugar, so many therapists have talked to me or written to me, and what's interesting is what they say to me is, you get to do what I can't do as a therapist.
Right. They have to stay objective.
They have to stay objective, and they can't do that thing where they're telling stories from their own lives or saying, yeah, this is completely complicated for me too. Mm-hmm. And they don't bring themselves into the story the way that I do as Sugar. And so many of them have written to me and really started using the Sugar column in their practice.
That's great.
They'll sit there and read out loud a letter to their client. It's really fascinating.
Well, it seems like that's certainly been the rule for advice columns, and it's interesting if you go to the Rumpus, you can actually read your columns from when you very first started. And when you very first started, it felt like you were trying to ease from Steve Almond, who had been funny and sort of pithy, and sort of move into yourself a little bit. And then at one point, I think it was your 12th column, you just sort of dropped a bomb, you told a really intensely personal story. Did you, at the time, was that a conscious choice to just change the way that you did it?
I think it was a slow evolution. And first, I want to say, it's true you could go to the Rumpus and read all my columns, but why would you do that when you could buy Tiny Beautiful Things?
Duh! I don't know why I said that. It's so much easier to have it in the book.
It's right there.
Oh, yeah.
But what happened is, that's right. what was really the evolution was, and this was interesting too, because usually as a writer, I'm just all alone in my room, and I wrote Wild. I didn't know what was going to happen to Wild once it was in the world. I created the whole thing, essentially by myself, and then set it off, to sea. And Sugar was different. It was each week I would almost always write the column within the 24 hours that it went live on the website. And then immediately, within a few minutes, I would start to see people tweeting about it or posting about it on Facebook or writing comments on the website. So I had this incredibly interactive relationship with my readers. And so when I started to tell stories about my life, I was fearful that they would think, oh, who is this woman just sort of hijacking the question? Because that wasn't my intention. I wasn't interested in telling a story about myself for the sake of telling a story about myself. I was really interested in using story as illumination, as allowing this, as a way of helping this letter writer see his or her problem more clearly. And so every time I did that, I got such a great response that you're right, I got braver and braver and braver. And I started writing things, really the deepest, darkest things about myself that I've ever written.
Well, and do you think that had you not had, certainly there was a lot of intensely personal stuff in Wild, but do you think that had you not had that anonymity from the outset, do you think it would have taken a lot longer for you to tell those stories?
I don't. I never wrote it from the perspective of anonymity. I always knew, when I took it on, I knew I was going to be anonymous for some time, but I knew that I would reveal my identity someday. And so everything I wrote as Cheryl Strayed, even though readers were reading me as Sugar. And also, in Wild, I certainly think one word to describe that book would be candid. I didn't withhold in that book. So it wasn't as if, to me, that Sugar, in Sugar I had great license or something. It was just it was an extension of what I was already doing. And I'd finished the first draft of Wild when I took on the Dear Sugar column. And so these two books were sort of being written at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, with some of the same stories, and it's interesting. Sugar is incredibly sweet. Sugar calls all of her readers sweet pea, right. and is incredibly. Steve Almond calls it radical empathy. The type of writing that Sugar does, and it does feel like acceptance, but at the same time, it's not unconditional from Sugar. And
right, Sugar's sort of a hard ass sometimes.
She is.
Are we allowed to say that on the radio?
I believe that you can, yeah. When it's appropriate, she definitely is. Mm-hmm. There was an article that Elizabeth Greenwood wrote in The Atlantic, and it was actually about Wild, but I think it applies to Sugar. And she was comparing Wild to Eat, Pray, Love. And she said, Eat, Pray, Love's undertone is that you deserve to be happy. Wild's is that you have to earn it. In what ways do you think that people earn their happiness?
By taking responsibility for the people they are, essentially. And this isn't to say that, one should just let people off the hook who have wronged you, for example, but ultimately we all have to come to terms with our past, our childhoods, and our futures. I think that there is this essential core belief that I have that has to do with self-sufficiency. That you have to get to the places that you want to go emotionally, professionally, when it comes to your education, your relationships, and really every aspect of your life, that ultimately it's up to you. And I think that Sugar says that over and over, is that there's a great amount of sorrow to be had about things that have prevented people from getting those places. But, essentially the choice we have, in Wild I write about this a lot, is the choice you have is just to stay there or walk back to where you had been, or to move forward in the direction of your intentions. And so Sugar, I'm always trying to tell people to move forward.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to have you read a little bit of it before you go. Ideally, I'd love to hear some of Tiny Beautiful Things.
Okay.
That's my favorite one.
Yeah. Okay. So the title column is Tiny Beautiful Things, and I'm going to just read a somewhat abbreviated version of it for time. Dear Sugar, I read your column religiously. I'm 22. From what I can tell by your writing, you're in your early 40s. My question is short and sweet. What would you tell your 20-something self if you could talk to her now. Love, Seeking Wisdom. Dear Seeking Wisdom, stop worrying about whether you're fat. You're not fat. Or rather, you're sometimes a little bit fat, but who gives a shit? There is nothing more boring and fruitless than a woman lamenting the fact that her stomach is round. Feed yourself, literally. The sort of people worthy of your love will love you more for this, sweet pea. In the middle of the night, in the middle of your 20s, when your best woman friend crawls naked into your bed, straddles you, and says, "You should run away from me before I devour you," believe her. You've all had that friend too, yeah. You are not a terrible person for wanting to break up with someone you love. You don't need a reason to leave. Wanting to leave is enough. Leaving doesn't mean you're incapable of real love or that you'll never love anyone else again. It doesn't mean you're morally bankrupt or psychologically demented or a nymphomaniac. It means you wish to change the terms of one particular relationship. That's all. Be brave enough to break your own heart. There are some things you can't understand yet. Your life will be a great and continuous unfolding. It's good you've worked hard to resolve childhood issues while in your 20s, but understand that what you resolve will need to be resolved again and again. You will come to know things that can only be known with the wisdom of age and the grace of years. Most of those things will have to do with forgiveness. Don't lament so much how your career is going to turn out. You don't have a career. You have a life. Do the work. Keep the faith. Be true blue. You're a writer because you write. Keep writing and quit your bitching. Your book has a birthday. You don't know what it is yet. You cannot convince people to love you. This is an absolute rule. No one will ever give you love because you want him or her to give it. Real love moves freely in both directions. Don't waste your time on anything else. Most things will be okay eventually, but not everything will be. Sometimes you'll put up a good fight and lose. Sometimes you'll hold on really hard and realize there is no choice but to let go. Acceptance is a small, quiet room. One hot afternoon during the era in which you've gotten yourself ridiculously tangled up with heroin, you will be riding the bus and thinking what a worthless piece of crap you are, when a little girl will get on the bus holding the strings of 2 purple balloons. She'll offer you one of the balloons, but you won't take it because you believe you no longer have a right to such tiny, beautiful things. You're wrong. You do. Your assumptions about the lives of others are in direct relation to your naive pomposity. Many people you believe to be rich are not rich. Many people you think have it easy worked hard for what they got. Many people who seem to be gliding right along have suffered and are suffering. Many people who appear to you to be old and stupidly saddled down with kids and cars and houses were once every bit as hip and pompous as you. When you meet a man in the doorway of a Mexican restaurant who later kisses you while explaining that this kiss doesn't mean anything, because much as he likes you, he's not interested in having a relationship with you or anyone right now, just laugh and kiss him back. Your daughter will have his sense of humor. Your son will have his eyes. The useless days will add up to something. The shitty waitressing jobs, the writing in your journal, the long meandering walks, the reading poetry and story collections and novels and dead people's diaries and wondering about sex and God and whether you should shave under your arms or not. These things are your becoming. One Christmas at the very beginning of your 20s, when your mother gives you a warm coat that she saved for months to buy, Don't look at her skeptically after she tells you she thought the coat was perfect for you. Don't hold it up and say it's longer than you like your coats to be and too puffy and possibly even too warm. Your mother will be dead by spring. That coat will be the last gift she gave you. You will regret the small thing you didn't say for the rest of your life. Say thank you, Sugar.
You're listening to Livewire.
Thank you.
And that was Cheryl Strayed reading from Tiny Beautiful Things.